The white man took my music, cleaned it up and made millions. I didn't even get credit. Little Richard's words from the 1950s weren't just about Pat Boone. They were about an entire system of theft. When Richard's Tutti Frutti came out in 1955, it barely got played on the radio because it was too wild, too black. But when Pat Boone sang the same song in a watered-down version that white America could handle, he made millions and never even mentioned Little Richard's name. This wasn't just copying a song. It was the most painful example of black culture being stolen by the white industry. This 10-year war between Richard and Boone reveals rock and roll's dirty truth. The talent was black, the money stayed white. Make sure to subscribe to keep following this story and not miss similar content. Now let's dive into the most painful story of the 1950s racist music industry. 1955, the birth of Tutti Frutti and the first theft. It all started in September 1955 at Cosmo Matassa Recording Studio in New Orleans. When Little Richard recorded Tutti Frutti, he was creating one of the most revolutionary moments in music history, but he didn't know it yet. The song's original lyrics were extremely obscene and reflected Richard's true identity, sexual freedom, queer codes, and the raw energy of black culture. Producer Bumps Blackwell knew this version would never get played on the radio and called in songwriter Dorothy Labostri to soften the lyrics. But even in its softened form, Tutti Frutti looked too dangerous for white America. When Specialty Records released the song, initial reactions were mixed. Black radio stations loved the song and started playing it, but white mainstream radio stations categorically rejected it. The program director's reasons were clear. Richard's falsetto voice was too feminine, the rhythm was too wild, and the overall vibe was too black. In Jim Crow America of 1955, these features were a death sentence for a song's commercial success. Specialty Records owner Art Roop knew this and proposed an alternative strategy to the company: make a cover version with a white artist. Pat Boone was working with Dot Records at the time, a 21-year-old white singer known for his clean American boy image. His white shoes, perfect hair, and family-friendly image made him exactly the figure white America was looking for. Dot Records boss Randy Wood saw commercial potential in Tutti Frutti, but decided the song needed to be sung by Boone. When Boone entered the studio in November 1955, his job was simple: take Little Richard's wild energy and make it consumable for white America. All the sexual references in the song were removed, the tempo was slowed down, and Richard's characteristic falsetto voice was transformed into a smooth tenor. 1956. Two versions, two Americas, one injustice. By early 1956, two versions of Tutti Frutti were on the market, and the results were predictably unfair. Little Richard's original version became a hit on black radio stations and climbed to the top of the rhythm and blues charts, but Pat Boone's version got played over and over on white mainstream radio stations and rose to number 12 on the Billboard pop charts. The sales figures revealed the painful truth of the story. While Richard's version sold about 500,000 copies, Boone's version sold over 1 million. The money difference was even more shocking. Richard made a total of $8,000 while Boone earned over $200,000. Behind this economic injustice wasn't just market dynamics but systematic racism. White radio stations had a policy of refusing to play black artists because advertisers believed black musicians contaminated white listeners. So radio programmers replaced black songs with versions sung by white artists, making the music safe. Pat Boone was the perfect representative of this system: white, handsome, trustworthy, and most importantly, non-threatening. When Little Richard learned about this situation, he was shocked because he was watching someone else profit from the song he created. Even worse, white America was starting to see Pat Boone as the owner of Tutti Frutti. Radio hosts would introduce the song as a new hit from Pat Boone and never mention Little Richard's name. This situation wasn't just economically erasing Richard, but artistically too. Unable to even get credit for the music he created, Richard was facing the brutal reality of the 1950s music industry. But the most painful thing was this: Pat Boone didn't seem bothered by this situation. In interviews, he didn't mention Little Richard's name and claimed the song as if he'd written it himself. For Boone, this was just a way of doing business, but for Richard, it was having his identity stolen. The relationship between the two musicians hadn't yet turned into direct conflict, but the foundation was laid. Richard was angry, and Boone wasn't even aware of it. 1956-1957, the expansion of systematic theft. After Tutti Frutti, things got even worse because this successful formula was applied to other Little Richard songs. When Long Tall Sally came out in March 1956, the same scenario repeated. Richard's original version became a hit on black radio, but Pat Boone immediately made a cover version, and his version got played on white radio. This time Richard was more prepared and made the song so fast and complex that Boone couldn't imitate it. Producer Bumps Blackwell's strategy was clear: if Pat Boone can copy this, I'll quit the music business. But the strategy only partially worked. Pat Boone tried to record Long Tall Sally, but couldn't match Richard's tempo, and his version was relatively unsuccessful. This small victory gave Richard morale, but the overall picture hadn't changed. White artists continued to copy black music and systematically made more money. After the Long Tall Sally case, Richard released another song called Rip It Up, and again Pat Boone immediately made a cover. This time Boone's version rose to number 17 on the pop charts, while Richard's original stayed at 27. By the end of 1956, the relationship between Little Richard and Pat Boone had turned into hostility, but this hostility hadn't yet reflected in the media. Richard was saying harsh things about Boone to friends but staying silent in the media because Specialty Records was silencing him. The company wanted to continue this system because they also profited from white artists' cover versions. Richard, bound by his contract to the company, risked losing his career if he raised his voice. By early 1957, the situation was becoming unbearable for Richard. Elvis Presley was also similarly copying black rhythm and blues songs and making millions. Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, and other black artists were experiencing the same injustice. The music industry saw black artists as a source of talent but didn't give them the credit and money they deserved. Richard was one of the most visible victims of this system, and his anger was growing every day. 1957, the Australia tour and breaking point. In October 1957, while Little Richard was on the Australia tour, he would make one of the most important decisions of his career: quit rock and roll. There were many factors behind this decision, but the injustice he experienced with Pat Boone and white cover artists was at the top of the list. Even while Richard was performing concerts in Australia, he knew Pat Boone was making money singing his songs in America. This situation had shaken Richard's faith in his rock and roll career, because no matter how hard he worked, no matter how good the music he made, white artists would always make more money. During the tour, Richard reportedly told friends, "I don't want to be part of this dirty game." Seeing Sputnik and interpreting it as a religious sign made his decision easier, but the truth was Richard was already tired of the music industry. The systematic theft by Pat Boone and other white artists had exhausted Richard both economically and spiritually. After returning from Australia, his choice to quit rock and roll and become a Seventh-day Adventist preacher wasn't an escape but a break from the system. Richard's leaving the stage didn't hurt Pat Boone's career at all. On the contrary, Boone reached the peak of his career in 1958 and 1959 and became one of America's most popular singers. In Richard's absence, Boone continued to cover other black artists' songs: Fats Domino's Ain't That a Shame, Little Willie John's Fever, and many more rhythm and blues classics, making millions by whitewashing them. By the late 1950s, Pat Boone was one of America's richest musicians, while Little Richard was living in poverty as a theology student at Oakwood College. 1958-1962, period of silence and simmering anger. Little Richard officially stayed away from the music scene from 1957 to 1962, but his anger toward Pat Boone never subsided. During this period, even while studying theology, Richard was thinking about how white artists stole black music and having conversations about this injustice. Friends at Oakwood College remember Richard often talking about Pat Boone and describing him as a musical thief. For Richard, Boone had become not just a rival but a symbol of the entire racist system. During this period, Pat Boone was at the peak of his career and had even broken into Hollywood. He was making movies, appearing as a guest on television programs, and being presented as one of America's most beloved figures. The foundation of Boone's success was songs he had stolen from Little Richard and other black artists. This situation angered not just Richard but the entire black music community. Chuck Berry said in an interview, "White men are getting rich with our music, and we still have to sit in the back of buses." In 1960, Little Richard made his first comeback attempt, but it failed. The music industry had changed, and now white rock and roll stars like Elvis Presley and Buddy Holly dominated the market. The new songs Richard released didn't get the same attention because listeners had gotten used to whitewashed versions instead of original black rock and roll. This situation showed Richard that his own music was being used against him. White artists had stolen his style, developed it, and taken over the market. When Richard fully returned to music in 1962, the scene he faced was painful. Pat Boone was still popular and being mentioned as an important figure in rock and roll history. Little Richard, meanwhile, was seen as an old legend and never captured his old success in the second period of his career. This injustice deeply affected Richard, and throughout the rest of the 1960s his anger toward Pat Boone continued to grow. 1965–1970, the beginning of public conflict. When the civil rights movement reached its peak in 1965, Little Richard started raising his voice too. He was now openly talking about the music industry's racism and criticizing Pat Boone by name. In an interview he said, "Pat Boone made millions with my music but never even mentioned my name. That's theft." This statement resonated in the media, and for the first time the tension between Richard and Boone was reflected to the public. Pat Boone's response to these accusations was defensive and far from apologetic. In an interview, Boone said, "I just made good music. I didn't steal anyone's music. Those songs were open to everyone." This statement made Little Richard even angrier because Boone still wasn't acknowledging that what he did was wrong. The conflict between the two musicians had now become not just economic but also a moral issue. In 1968, when Little Richard appeared on the Dick Cavett Show on television, he brought up the Pat Boone issue again. "White artists took our music and got rich. Pat Boone is the best example of that. He bought houses and cars with my songs, but I was living in a rental," he said. This statement was applauded by the audience because during the civil rights era, America had become more sensitive about racial injustice. By the early 1970s, Pat Boone's career was starting to slow down, but Little Richard's anger didn't subside. Richard was now attacking not just Boone but all white cover artists and the racist music industry. He was describing Elvis Presley as the man who stole my style and calling music companies modern slave owners. These harsh statements were making Richard popular in some circles but marginalizing him even more in the music industry. 1980–1990. Confrontation and half-peace. In the 1980s, Little Richard and Pat Boone's paths crossed several times, and these encounters created tense moments each time. In 1984, during the opening of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, both were among the guests, and they talked face-to-face for the first time there. Witnesses remember that conversation starting cold but Boone eventually trying to apologize. When Boone said, "Richard, I was young and ignorant back then, I wronged you." Richard's response was unexpected. "An apology isn't enough, Pat, you stole my life." This confrontation didn't break the ice between them, but at least it showed that Boone was aware of what he'd done. In 1987, when they appeared on a television program together, Boone apologized again and said, "Little Richard should have been given credit for the covers I did back then, you're right about that." Richard seemed to accept this apology, but he reportedly told friends afterward, "A late apology doesn't change anything." In the early 1990s, Pat Boone wrote a book and made more detailed statements about the songs he took from Little Richard. "Now I look back and see that those covers were unfair. I owe Little Richard and other black artists," he wrote. This confession softened Richard a bit, and in a 1993 interview he said, "Pat finally told the truth. Maybe I was too hard on him, but real peace never fully came because the economic injustice was never corrected." Pat Boone was still getting royalties from the 1950s cover songs and continued to make millions. Little Richard, meanwhile, was struggling with financial difficulties and waiting for compensation for the past. In the late 1990s, Richard summed up the situation by saying, "Pat apologized, but the money doesn't come back. The lost years don't come back." 2020 Legacy and Continued Injustice. In the 21st century, the Little Richard and Pat Boone story began to be remembered as an iconic example of the music industry's racism. Academics, music historians, and civil rights activists pointed to this case as one of the most painful examples of cultural appropriation. In the 2000 free book The Race Beat, The Little Richard-Pat Boone relationship was examined in detail and described as the perfect example of how white America stole black culture. In the final years of his life, Little Richard started speaking more softly about Pat Boone but never forgot the injustice. In a 2010 interview he said, "Pat Boone is a good person but he was part of a bad system. He didn't create that system but he benefited from it and didn't question that benefit." This assessment showed Richard's matured perspective. The problem wasn't just Boone, it was the entire system. Pat Boone, as he aged, expressed more regret about the cover songs from the 1950s. In a 2015 documentary he said, "I wish I had given Little Richard his due back then, invited him on stage, sung with him, but this regret couldn't change the past." Full reconciliation between the two never happened while Little Richard was alive. When Little Richard died in 2020, Pat Boone made a statement and said, "We lost one of music's greatest pioneers. I learned so much from him." This statement was seen as sincere by some and criticized as too late and insufficient by others. Although Little Richard's legacy had emerged from Pat Boone's shadow, the economic injustice from the 1950s was never corrected. The ripple effect: how the Richard Boone conflict changed music. The battle between Little Richard and Pat Boone didn't just affect these two men. It fundamentally changed how the music industry approached race and credit. By the late 1960s, record companies started adding original artist credits on cover versions because of the controversy Richard had sparked. Artists like James Brown and Aretha Franklin benefited from this change, as they were able to negotiate better contracts that protected their music from being copied without compensation. Richard's public fight, though painful for him personally, created protections for the next generation of black artists. The economic impact of the Richard Boone case extended far beyond individual careers. Music industry analyst Nelson George estimated in his 1988 book The Death of Rhythm and Blues that black artists collectively lost approximately $500 million between 1954 and 1964 due to white cover versions systematically outselling original recordings. Little Richard's case was just the tip of the iceberg. Chuck Berry lost money to cover versions, Big Mama Thornton's Hound Dog was turned into Elvis's biggest hit, and countless other black artists watched their songs get cleaned up and resold to white audiences. The psychological toll on Richard went deeper than financial loss. Friends and collaborators from the 1960s remember Richard becoming increasingly bitter about his place in music history. He'd see Pat Boone on TV and just turn it off, recalled pianist Billy Preston, who worked with Richard in the mid-60s. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about being erased from history while you were still alive. This erasure affected Richard's mental health, contributing to his struggles with depression and his continued cycling between secular music and religious ministry. The legal battle that never was. What many people don't know is that Little Richard considered suing Pat Boone and Dot Records in 1959. According to documents discovered in Specialty Records archives, Richard consulted with civil rights lawyer Thurgood Marshall about potential copyright infringement cases. Marshall, who would later become a Supreme Court justice, told Richard that the law at the time offered almost no protection for black artists against white cover versions. "The system is designed to protect them, not you," Marshall reportedly said. This legal consultation revealed the cruel reality. In 1950s America, covering someone's song wasn't illegal as long as you paid the minimal statutory royalty to the publisher. The original artist received nothing from cover versions, and there was no requirement to credit them. Pat Boone was operating within the law. It was the law itself that was unjust. Richard dropped the idea of suing because he knew he couldn't win, not because he lacked a moral case. The financial details of this injustice are staggering when examined closely. Little Richard earned approximately $600 in songwriting royalties from Pat Boone's version of Tutti Frutti, the same song that earned Boone over $200,000. This wasn't because Boone was cheating the system, it was because the system was designed to benefit performers over creators, and white performers over black ones. Richard didn't own his publishing rights, which had been sold to Specialty Records for minimal upfront payment, and he had no legal claim to performance royalties from covers. The cultural appropriation conversation begins. Long before cultural appropriation became a commonly used term, Little Richard was articulating exactly what it meant. In a 1970 interview with Rolling Stone magazine, Richard said something remarkably prescient: "They don't want the Negro, they want the Negro sound." They don't want us at the party, they just want to dance to our music. This statement captured the essence of cultural appropriation decades before academics would develop formal theories about it. Richard's critique extended beyond just Pat Boone to the entire structure of how white America consumed black culture. He saw how white teenagers would buy Boone's records but cross the street to avoid black people. He understood that his music was considered acceptable only when filtered through white performers who made it safe. This wasn't just about stolen songs, it was about a culture that wanted black creativity without black people. The irony wasn't lost on Richard, that the same parents who bought Pat Boone records for their children because he was wholesome were buying sanitized versions of songs created by a queer black man who wore makeup and screamed into microphones. If those parents had known the true origin and meaning of Tutti Frutti, they would have been horrified. Pat Boone served as a cultural laundromat, washing the blackness and queerness out of rock and roll so white America could consume it without confronting their prejudices. The lasting impact on both men's legacies. Today, music historians universally recognize Little Richard as one of rock and roll's true originators, while Pat Boone is often relegated to footnotes, or worse, used as an example of cultural theft. This historical correction happened slowly, and only after Richard spent decades fighting for recognition. Boone's legacy became increasingly complicated as cultural attitudes changed. What was seen as smart business in the 1950s looks like exploitation through a modern lens. For Pat Boone, this shift in perception has been difficult. In his later years, Boone has given numerous interviews trying to explain or justify his role in the 1950s cover system. "I was just a kid doing what the record company told me to do," he said in a 2012 interview. "I didn't understand the racial dynamics at play." These defenses ring hollow to many critics who point out that Boone was an adult making conscious career decisions that benefited from racial privilege, even if he didn't fully understand the system he was participating in. Conclusion: the ripple effect continues. The battle between Little Richard and Pat Boone didn't just affect these two men, it fundamentally changed how the music industry approached race and credit. Today, Little Richard is remembered as one of the fathers of rock and roll and isn't living in Pat Boone's shadow. But this recognition doesn't compensate for the economic and artistic credit Richard deserved while he was alive. The story of Little Richard and Pat Boone teaches us this: talent and creativity sometimes aren't enough. If systematic racism exists, even the greatest genius may not get what they deserve. The economic gap between what Richard earned and what he deserved was never bridged. He died in 2020 having received only a fraction of the wealth his innovations generated. Meanwhile, the system that exploited him continued to profit from his music long after his death. Streaming services pay pennies while using his revolutionary recordings, and his songs continue to be licensed for commercials and movies, with most of the money going to corporations rather than his heirs. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is that this story isn't unique. Little Richard's experience was shared by countless black artists who watched their culture get commodified, their innovations stolen, and their contributions erased. From Big Mama Thornton to Sister Rosetta Tharpe, from Chuck Berry to Bo Diddley, the pattern repeated. Black artists created, white artists profited, and history had to be corrected decades later. Little Richard's loud, persistent voice forced some of that correction to happen while he was still alive, but the economic justice he deserved never came. And this lesson isn't just for the music industry but for all of society. Recognizing genius isn't enough if the systems of exploitation remain unchanged.